Why would I hire that?
Okay. Hi. I'm Tammy. I'm our events coordinator and community manager here at eBay. And I lost my notes that I was going to say. So bear with me here. First of all, if you've been to an event here, you know how this room works. If you have not, during the day, our employees use it as their rumpus room, as our GM/VP Kevin Hurst likes to call it. And at night, we make it available to the tech community for meetups, workshops, various and sundry events. We appreciate so much being welcomed by the tech community here and want to do our part to support them equally. And as far as supporting goes, thank you all so much for being here for our first eBay Tech Tuesday. We appreciate it so much. We're super excited about the Tech Tonight on Culture. Culture was Merriam-Webster's most used word of 2014, and it shows no signs of slowing down, especially in tech. If you've had conversations at any time, probably within the last 3 hours at your place of business, or in interviewing for a job, or in social media, or on Twitter, you've seen culture used, and it's used in all sorts of ways. So, we have put together this lovely panel of people who will be talking about culture tonight, and moderated by Sara Morrow, who is my coworker and office mate here at eBay. So with no further ado, I'm going to turn it over to her.
Thank you, Tammy. How are we doing? Can you hear me in the back? Excellent. Big round to Tammy and Bruce who put this together for us. Well, great. Tammy already got us started a little bit with why we're here, and so let's go ahead and introduce the panelists and dive right in. We will, we will be taking a Q&A at the end, so please do save your questions, write them down. We're excited to engage and continue the conversation, but at least get some topics out right now and get it started. Here to my right, we have Krista Berlincourt, Communications Manager at Simple. Lindsay, Wolff, Logsdon, Co-founder and Advisor, Culture Lab. Bruce Yarnall, Director of Mobile QA at eBay Marketplaces. And Dr. Truxillo, Professor, Industrial Organizational Psychology at Portland State University. So we did do some preliminary work with the panelists to make sure, to just get the conversation started. So we'll refer to some of that, but as well, looking forward to some off-the-cuff conversation and really diving in deep. I'd like for Dr. Truxillo to start us off. And he, with the definition of culture, we ask this question to everyone. Has your definition of culture changed over time? And if so, how and why? And each panelist will respond, but we'll go ahead and start with Dr. Truxillo.
Okay, so everybody can hear me okay? So I would say that my definition of culture hasn't changed. That's stayed pretty stable in terms of what the research shows over the last 30, 40 years. It's basically the shared understandings and beliefs, ways of communicating that people have in a group. The group could either be an organization as a whole, it could be an individual team. Teams have sometimes have quite different cultures within an organization, so there's typically not a uniform culture within an organization, although it may share some aspects. And of course, the culture can be affected by issues like where the organization is located, the part of the world, etc. I think the way that we've seen that culture has changed, not the definition of culture, but that organizations are changing a lot. That's sort of saying the obvious in the last 30 years. And that we're seeing that people have different sorts of expectations for organizations now than they might have at one time. That's maybe due to generational differences, but it could also be simply due to the world changing and people coming to expect more from organizations or different things from their employer, or expecting less sometimes from their employer. And so I think the key thing here is to making sure that people understand the culture, that people are hired for the right culture, to fit the culture, that people who are coming in understand the culture when they come in, and then as much as possible, the good onboarding is done when people come in so that they can learn the culture. There's a lot that organizations can do to help people fit, and when people come in, there's a lot that they can do to learn how to fit into the culture. We can talk about that more later.
Great. Krista, you want to go here? You got the mic.
Oh, okay. Switch. Am I on? Yeah? Okay. So I think for me, my definition of culture hasn't changed so much as my understanding of what culture encompasses. Prior to Simple, I worked in a corporate world for a company that starts with micro and ends with soft. And I can't say that I had a strong perception of culture because culture was largely prescriptive. So it was, this is our way. You hear the term a lot, the Microsoft way. That was very much felt and it was prescribed. And so in large part, I perceived culture to be a set of prescribed beliefs, a prescribed way of doing things. Coming to Simple in an environment where culture was felt, culture was shared, and culture was largely an organic manifestation of what leadership held at a premium. So stepping back and seeing that and looking at how can I contribute to the culture, how can I shift it, and then how can I internalize it, I think the biggest difference to thread off of what you said is that that it's not prescriptive, that it just exists. And those companies that do seek to prescribe culture, they tend to have a difficult time watching that, seeing it through. Bruce?
All right. So when I was asked to be on this panel, I was very surprised because I don't really think about culture as a product or as a thing that is. Culture is. It's just all your people and how you work. My experience through life has generally been engineering, software engineering in Portland for the last 20 years. Quite often on small teams. Critical Path I've worked with since '96, and then we were acquired by eBay. It's been quite interesting to experience culture as it blossoms out into a multinational. And so as far as my definition of culture, I know what I don't want, what cultures I don't want to be in. I use the negative space model to define culture, and since my focus is so heavily based in software engineering, a culture where I don't feel like I can contribute is not a culture I want to be part of, and a culture where I don't understand the context of the decision-making process or have access to the decision makers is not a culture I want to be part of. A culture that is based on conflict with other cultures inside of the organization is not something I want to be a part of. So as I used to enjoy making software, now I'm a director. So I have to spend most of my time just smoothing out conflicts in culture, perhaps. But I've been able to actually do everything I can to try and build that environment for the people that work for me. So hopefully I can provide a counterpoint, or perhaps I was also very excited to be on this panel because I want to hear what comes out of these three heads next to me who actually studied it instead of kind of living it the way I did as an old hippie. So that's my culture talk.
Great, Lindsay.
I had what I consider incredible fortune to graduate from my undergrad in December of 2001 at the very, very bottom of a really dark place in trying to find a job. So I made the decision to go be a ski bum in Lake Tahoe. And the first job that I got was doing human resources seasonally for a ski resort here at Tahoe, if you've ever been there. And it was really interesting. A lot of my job was to attract ski bums to come and work, other ski bums to come and work at the resort. And when they would ask what the culture was like, my response would be, oh, well, we're the ski resort where you can have dreadlocks and nose piercings and wear Hawaiian shirts, as opposed to, say, Heavenly, where they give you a branded polo to wear and you have to have closed shoes. So, to me, back then, culture was very much just the rules and regulations that governed the company. It was very tactical. And as I progressed in my career in human resources, what I discovered is how much strategy actually needs to go in to a culture in order to make it effective, in order to really drive the purpose and values that a company has, to help that purpose blossom into a healthy culture.
Great, Lindsay, and you had responded about 6 different pieces of culture: purpose, values, behaviors, recognition, rituals, and cues. So if you could maybe expand on, maybe who owns these different pieces, where these come from within an organization, and, potentially we have some audience members who are thinking about how do they build that in a new company, or maybe revitalizing their own company culture, maybe if there's a natural order for those to be laid out.
Sure. So I helped found an organization called Culture Lab X, and Culture Lab X is essentially a community of cultural practitioners, is how we like to describe it. But there were 5 of us in the Bay Area in all sorts of different industries and all sorts of different roles. We used to get together over beers and talk about our company cultures and how do you actually affect cultural change within your company. I was working for a startup at the time. I was working for Square in the Bay Area. I was the first human resources person there, so I was tasked with how to grow that culture very rapidly. And we realized that there wasn't a good place for a community to have conversations around culture. So part of what Culture Lab X does is we have workshops to explore different types of tools of affecting cultural change and things like that. But we realized that there also wasn't a definitive way to talk about the different aspects of culture. So purpose and values, those are the strategic elements that any leadership team really needs to have nailed down as their reason for being a business in the first place. You would be hard-pressed to really create an authentic product in the world if you didn't have purpose and values at your company. Customers are really expecting to understand what companies' purpose and values are. You'd be hard to really inspire employees who come to work at your company, so purpose and values are those strategic elements that you need to outline early on in your company and revisit fairly often to guide your company. The tactical elements that you use to give direction to your company around how to bring that purpose and value to life are behaviors and recognition. So intended behaviors, how do you expect people to interact in line with the values that your company has? How should employees interact? How should employees interact with your customers? Things like that. Recognition is how do you reward people for enacting those behaviors that you've set out. So those are all the tactical pieces. And then the final 2 elements of culture that we've identified are cues and rituals. Rituals are the habitual behaviors. Are people actually interacting the way that you would like them to? Are people showing each other respect? Do people actually get their timesheets in at 5 p.m. every Friday? Probably not in my experience. And then cues are sort of the physical representations. I think this room is a fantastic homage to the concept of cues. It's a fun room. People apparently even foos grow here in this room. There's an element of, you instantly get a sense that eBay's culture, especially here in Portland, is very fun, very interactive. Feedback is solicited literally on a chalkboard wall. So cues are those physical, tangible elements. Now, one thing that's really interesting is that for as amazing of a purpose and values that you establish as a leadership team, as careful as you may put together outline of expected behaviors in a company handbook and a very diligent recognition program around those behaviors, where the rubber really hits the road is in those cues and rituals. That's how people interact every day. That's what it's actually like to come in and work in the physical space. If you really want to understand what's going on in a company, you have to pay attention to those cues and rituals. They're sort of the bottom of the hierarchy, like a Maslow's hierarchy element of company culture. The cues and rituals are the most primal, maybe is a good way of describing it, elements of your company culture. And I think, everybody always goes to the Enron example where you can have a purpose of integrity, but if day to day the rituals of your company are that people aren't honest in their dealings, your company can literally implode. So those are all the pieces that we've outlined. In terms of that hierarchy, new businesses have to start with the most strategic elements, that purpose, why is your company there in the first place, and the values. What do you believe is the right way forward for your company? If you are an existing company and you're looking to change your culture, oftentimes companies will immediately jump in, what's our new purpose statement, and what sort of values do we want to embody here at this company? And then they just sort of drop this new reality on employees and say, go with it. At Culture Lab X, we really feel like that's a missed opportunity. The reality is you have to understand the day-to-day interactions that are going on with your company. You have to understand those rituals and those cues, the day in and day out cultural interactions of your employees. And you have to do a gap analysis of where you wish your company would be, what your purpose and values are, against what the reality on the ground is. And then you bridge those two by setting a new set of expected cultures and a new recognition program in service to those new behaviors.
Great.
Supervisor says, you really need to work more quickly. Well, you can't say, I want you to work more quickly, but we really value safety here. I mean, that's not giving the employees figure out pretty quickly what the real values are there. And so I think it's really important to have buy-in. Culture is a very difficult thing to change, that was mentioned already, and I think one of the things is to make sure that the management from the top on down understand that. And probably one of the most important things we found in our research is leaders of teams having good relationships with their employees where they can communicate openly, and that the leaders model what it is they want people to do. If they want to have a good safety culture, they need to be carrying out safe behaviors and show that to them. And it's with any other aspect of culture the same way. If it's whatever it is you're trying to communicate, it needs to be modeled and carried out by the leaders in the organization.
Great. And if you guys aren't familiar, Simple grew just recently very rapidly. So I'd love to hear maybe for you to expand, Krista, a little bit on, how did this, maybe when you started, how many employees roughly versus, sort of that transition. I believe you guys have close to 180 employees.
Yeah, a little more.
Wow.
Today. When I started a little over 2 years ago, I was the first female employee who was not in our customer relations organization, and I was 30-something. I don't actually know. I think that's probably like part of my startup badge that I'm not holding correctly, having a number. But that says a lot. People didn't refer to themselves as like, I was number 31, or I was number 2, or I was number 1. I have a lot of friends in the Bay Area who are at various startups, and they very much know exactly what number they are. It's the first thing they'll tell you about the company that they're at. I'm sure it's something Lindsay's nodding, like that's the way it works. And I joined, I didn't have no work. I was the only person who was in marketing. I was neither executive team, nor an engineer, nor customer relations. So I think for me, in terms of culture and growth, it was watching the company grow. In the last year since our acquisition by a very, very large company, we've remained independent, but we've also tripled headcount in a year, or we will triple headcount in a year, which is in about a month here. You bring in 100 new people rapidly, you are constantly looking at checks and balances to say, are we doing this correctly? Are we building the relationships we want? But most importantly, are we holding true the beliefs that we set out with? We've had to re-examine, we were doing a branding exercise. And at Simple, our product is very much a byproduct of the culture that exists. So we seek out to help our customers. That is reliant on hiring people that extend that cultural value, that exhibit empathy, that are invested in other people within the company. We really had to make sure that we were bringing those people in, that we were screening for them, that we adopted more, not really stringent, but I suppose creative interview tactics, and those intangibles are difficult, especially in an interview when you have a half hour with someone. Maybe you give 4 people a half hour with someone, but that's still 2 hours to decide if they're a cultural fit. And that scaling rapidly is difficult. But I think we've done it really well.
Do you want to touch a little bit on onboarding? Donald mentioned how onboarding is so important. Maybe some of the the things that you made sure and included to help them become more and more part of the team and the culture.
Yeah, so we probably 2 months into what I would call the surge of bringing on new employees, we developed an education team. And now that team, actually, as of last week, is a fully fledged department lead, a director of education. But we developed a program whereby new hires, regardless of what organization they were joining or their tenure, they could be a VP or they might be an entry-level customer relations agent. They were sort of given the same kind of rush week type cultural overview. And they would listen to a session from the founders, and they might have a session from someone else in customer relations, and they had these sort of 1-hour classes. And the idea was giving a consistent overview for all employees who join the company from a variety of voices. One of the things you'll see at a lot of companies is the culture talks come from the top, right? So the CEO comes in and he talks about what culture means, and then he exits and you never hear from him again. For Simple, it was about developing a program that was representative of our culture. It was democratic. It involved sessions that were suggested by various employees. You could also nix a session. Maybe there was one that used to happen and people said, well, that kind of sucked. I didn't learn anything. We happily solicit and take that feedback to heart. So building that program over the past year has been really instrumental for us.
Great. I have one more follow-up question for you. Can you touch on maybe a difficult or challenging situation that you had to address during this rapid growth?
I wouldn't call it a situation, but being acquired, right? So that is in itself a challenge, in that you are asking your employees to quickly adapt. And I remember the day that we told everyone that we were being acquired, and we were sort of braced for backlash or surprise, or the various coping emotions that people go through, right? There's like grief, etc. And the big thing that we tried to make very clear, not only to employees, but to our customers and to other folks in the industry, was that we would remain an independent party. Simple would remain an independent acquisition. I think keeping that independence has been a challenge in that we have to remind ourselves and speak up to our constituents across the board, whether it is our parent company to say, actually, step back. You want us to remain who we are. We encourage our customers to let us know if they feel like we're being weird. So I think it is soliciting that feedback consistently, because the truth is, it doesn't matter who you are. You can't see from the outside in. And so we hired a brand agency to give us some impartial third-party analysis and say, here's what you're doing well, here's what you're not doing well, and to really look from outside.
Great. Cindy, Bruce, you as well talked about being acquired from CPS to eBay, and talked about being repelled by a company which might have several cultures in conflict. Did you find that to be any of the case as CPS, became more and more a part of eBay over the last 4 years?
So there was definitely conflict, but it wasn't what you would expect it to be. When you're working in small teams, you assume they're going to take away your ownership and your craft, and you're just going to become a resource. You're a number on an agile chart. And that didn't happen at all. That was quite surprising to actually come to eBay and discover that almost across the board, San Jose, Portland, everywhere, people were actually cared a lot about their product. There was just too many projects going in too many directions, and communication wasn't happening, and the overall context wasn't there for what we were doing. We were lucky when we were acquired because we were building all of the native apps. And that's an actual product you can identify with. It's something you can touch, it's something that you can associate with. But if you're on a team that's building a service that's going to be consumed by a product that hasn't even been written into a client yet, you know, you have a much less tangible thing to touch. So as far as conflicts, the conflicts were really about when is the product done, or what's your ownership path through your product. And as the client team, when we release an app into the world to millions and millions of people, and something goes wrong, it kind of comes down on your head. Even if the problem is a service behind us, or even if the problem is content or localization. And so a big challenge was accepting that while we owned our product, we needed everybody behind us to help us make it work. And I'm not really wrapping this thought up too cohesively, but it was amazing to find out that everybody cared as much as they did. Where the conflicts did come into place really do come around resources. That as a team you want to make your own decisions, but in a large org, design owns design, product owns product. Learning to accept that and how to build that into your software, and also how to echo back upstream. That's a really cool idea, that's a really cool design, but these are the reasons why it's not a good idea. You know, whether it's the operating system, whether it's the challenge of our infrastructure. Finding that voice, it took years. But a lot of the people that worked at Critical Path, we actually kind of considered ourselves corporate refugees, because we'd all gone off to work for a major corporation, and we were like, this is horrifying. And then we wanted to work for a small company where we could solve a problem and work on a team of 5 people. And sometimes a project would be, you know, sometimes I'd play the product manager, other times I would play the QA, you know, I mean, it's like playing a house, but you build software. And it was fun, and we owned it. I think when we were acquired, we all assumed that all of a sudden we would be subsumed by this giant organization, and we would all just want to wander back to our refugee state. It didn't happen. I mean, we're almost all still here, and we love working together. And so, again, we're in this place where we're trying to identify culture as a product, but culture really is all just the people that I work with and how we work together.
Great. So it's kind of talking about challenging situations. Lindsay or Donald, do you have anything in addition about maybe something that's come up, or that you want to speak on? I think that's a fun way to talk about cultures.
Well, one of the things that we've discovered at Culture Lab X, and that's sort of a rallying cry for us, is that we don't inherently feel that there's a culture that is wrong or right. I've known some really crappy companies who make a ton of money. Companies who go full force into burning employees out, and because they produce phenomenal work, people are willing to be burnt out in order to have that name on their resume. The Bay Area is ripe with these types of companies right now. That company is getting good talent, making money, and they do it despite not having a stellar company culture. So it's hard to say that their culture is wrong, because I think the ultimate judge of business is, are you making money? Which is sort of sad to say. Maybe not in this town, in other towns. There are companies who make money while having a really crappy company culture. I think it's fair to say that from an individual perspective, it's fair to say that I think that company culture is good, and I think this company culture is bad, because you're coming at it from your own perspective. I think that one thing that really concerns me is that we're transitioning from a time when people spent their entire lives working for one corporation, and they worked their way up, and they stayed there, and they were very loyal, to a type of economy where do you know the statistic on how many different companies a single individual has to work at?
It depends on whether you're a millennial or a baby boomer. It's something like 5 for baby boomers and 30s for millennials last time. So that's what's projected to be.
So millennials will work at 30 different companies throughout the course of their career. That's amazing. They have all those amazing experiences. We're so mobile now. It's so easy to do that. In the last 10 years, I've moved from Portland to Austin to San Francisco and back to Portland and had amazing jobs in each of those places. What I worry about is that companies are struggling with how to gracefully exit employees. Given that we're so mobile, given that we'll work at 30 different places, companies have to come to terms with the confidence that your company culture is strong enough to attract top talent, that you don't worry if someone makes the decision to leave, and in fact you send them on their way with an element of grace. I've worked in the design industry, I've worked in the startup industry, and I will tell you those industries are very small. And in my human resources career, I've really, really worked hard to exit people with grace, to make sure that when a person leaves a company that they feel like the company is behind them, that the company wishes them well. You'd be surprised at how many people thank me for those sentiments. But the truth is, companies can get, maybe leadership is a better way, leadership can get personally hurt when top talent decides to leave their company. And the truth is, we're just mobile. It's just a fact. We're going to move on from a company. So gracefully allowing an employee to move on, I think, is going to become a more and more important element of company culture moving forward.
I think that's a really good example, and I like the sort of the offboarding idea that you're bringing up. One of the things that communicates a company's culture is how people are treated under those conditions. So it's not just the person that's leaving that's getting perhaps shoddy treatment, but it sends a message to the rest of the organization. This is the kind of place we are. We kind of kick you in the teeth and walk you out the door under security guards when you quit. And there's been quite a bit of research on the organizational justice field, looking at how the fair treatment of employees not just affects them, but affects others who are watching it. That it's not like, we're all bystanders. We're all watching what's going on. This isn't, it's not happening in a vacuum. And so I think a company that doesn't take that seriously is really creating a lot of problems for themselves. And again, it comes down to a lot of times those individual interactions that really was where the rubber meets the road. It has to start at the top, and but it has to travel down through the organization, and maintaining a culture and certainly changing it is really a hard business. It takes a lot of work, but it can be done. But I think that your offboarding example is a really good one.
Great.
I just want to throw something in kind of Portland style. When people leave my org, I know I'm going to end up working for them. This is Portland. So it's not a huge city. This isn't Silicon Valley. We're all going to work together. I was lucky. I've been in the industry long enough to see it happen. And at Critical Path, we work for multiple different clients. But there really has to be a perception that every employee you've got is going to come back to you at some point, whether it's as your boss or whether it's as somebody who's going to run a division for you. And that's, from your very first hire, you bring in somebody that you're training from the ground up, and you just see that spark of what it takes to get the job done, but you're going to put all the training into it. 20 years from now, you're going to know that person. So it's critical, especially in Portland, guys, this is our town, that we understand we're all going to be working together.
Great, and actually, keep that. The next question is going to come down to Donald, and I'm glad we brought up hiring because that's going to be sort of our next subtopic. However, one thing I did want to touch on prior, which has been, spoken about, are teams and subculture of teams, and so in particular, is there research that is important to employees or candidates, the sub-team or the overall culture? And maybe how do you distinguish that, and what's being talked about out there?
That's not an easy one-day answer. Thanks for the tough one. I would say that the answer there is really that it's both. I mean, the team is going to be affected by the culture that it's embedded in, so it's not like it's completely independent. But you do have to think about who you're going to be working with on a day-to-day basis. And I think it's really important to look very carefully at that team. I think sometimes I've seen people go for a brand. You know, you're sort of talking about there are certain organizations that are having a brand that looks good on your resume, and people get into the individual team, and it's terrible. And or a bad fit, or maybe not. Let's not say terrible. We won't say crappy. We'll say it's not a good fit for them. We'll say, okay. And so I think it's really important for people to be aware of that when they're coming in. Keep your eyes and ears open. It's not just from the organization standpoint. It's from the applicant standpoint. Keep your eyes and ears open for how people are treated, how the interactions take place, how are you treated during the application process. It's one of the things that I study is how applicants are treated during the application process, the effects that can have. And remember that as a hiring manager, the way you treat people is a message for them. It's that you're sending them a message. And that's letting them know how people generally interact with each other. And if it's not a very nice interaction during the application process, all things being equal, they may choose to go somewhere else if that sends the message that it's not a good fit. The term people use for this is signaling theory, that it's sending a signal.
That's funny. It reminds me, sometimes there's the glass of water test in recruiting or in interviewing, and if the applicant doesn't pick up, the candidate does not take their water glass into the kitchen after the interview, that is a telltale sign. So remember that.
We have one in our own department here in the psychology department. Well before my time, there was a candidate apparently that they took him to a Chinese restaurant and he would not share any of his food, and so they took that as a message in itself. Like, okay, what will this guy be like to work with? So it didn't work well for him.
I don't think I would share my food either.
What's that?
It's on the.
Krista only eats kale. Nobody would want to eat kale.
I do only eat kale. I was thinking, in regard to specific teams, when I joined Simple, it was very loudly proclaimed that we were an engineering culture, or a culture of engineers. I'm not an engineer, to be clear. I'm a wordsmith. And coming into an engineering culture meant some changes for the company as a whole, actually, to sort of accommodate me, to create new processes, right? It's a systems and beliefs. How do we communicate with each other? I did not want to have to push all of my conversation into Markdown and then GitHub. I did that for a while. It didn't work very well. It meant that I was, having like 2 chats a day with people. But I think that's another question is your culture, does it actually inhibit others, right? So maybe the predominant culture is fantastic for 80% of people, but then at what cost to the other 20%? Building an organizational culture that is inclusive, that is sensitive, that's empathetic, and that solicits feedback so that you know if that's the case. Because you're not going to have a company, once it reaches scale or beyond 100 employees, people won't work the same. Even in a technology environment, you will have people who are working in back-end, front-end, different organizations culturally in most places, certainly in ours. Design, front-end design, back-end design. It just depends on what's your preferred sort of culture within, and then how do you scale that to reach the organization.
Great. And so I'd like to touch a little bit more on candidates' perception, and then we can talk about, personally, all of you have probably been candidates at one point, but then go into the hiring decision process. Donald, what are some of the factors you study with candidates' perception of cultural fit during the interview process? And, obviously you study it, so I imagine it's important. So why is it important?
One of the things that, there was just a study that came out actually in the last few weeks that looked at how people's treatment and fair treatment during the hiring process can actually affect whether they take a job or not. Again, if it's, if the economy's bad, okay, an organization doesn't have to can do a lot of what they want. If we get back into where the economy's really hot, people may have choices. And so the way that they're treated can really make a difference. And that includes things like there's a whole framework that this is built around, saying that it's the using procedures that seem open and clearly related to the job, giving people feedback, communicating with them during the hiring process. One of the things I was really impressed with is we were on a panel at our academic conference with some folks that work at Google, and one of the things they made really clear is that they stay in touch with candidates throughout the process. They really try to shepherd them through. And that makes a huge difference. It's an enormous difference, and it communicates something about that organization. So I think one of the best ways to think about this is, sometimes people, the other thing is that there will be people who don't get the job not because they're not qualified, or you might not want to hire them one day. In fact, you might want to hire them one day, so that it's kind of going back to your point, it's a small world, and so you want to make sure not to burn some bridges as an employer. And so thinking about how you treat people, some people won't get the job, but on top of that, we find that even if a person isn't hired, that the way that you treat them during the process can make a huge difference to them personally, but also in how likely they would be to take the job. It's all, think of treat them the way you'd like to be treated. That's the simplest thing to remember. Just keep that in mind.
And you mentioned in prior communication, you mentioned about job performance, job satisfaction, and that the candidates need to assess their fit.
Right.
Is that both skill set and culturally in regards to job performance, job satisfaction?
Yeah, I would say that is actually both of those. It's the person's fit in terms of their skill set, of course. But I think people will be looking at that pretty clearly. I mean, the people that will be interviewing you or trying to screen you in some way, whatever methods people are using. But the way to the other part of it is really understanding how well you'll fit in with the organization. And it starts. It's a process. It starts from the application, from the recruitment process. What's that like? To the application process, to after people are hired. When they first enter the organization, for instance, I have a good friend whose husband works in tech. For a startup, at one point he said he got there, and for the first week he never had lunch with anybody. Nobody ever asked him if he had any questions, and it was a real turnoff. And it was kind of like, he eventually did have to take this upon himself, but it was not a great place to be. The way to think about this is, and it really comes from both sides, that people have to see whether they're a fit. The organization has to decide if the person is a fit, and people have to work, both sides have to work together, really to make that person feel as though they fit. And if they don't, well then maybe they will move on at some point. But that fit is probably one of the biggest things that drives employee satisfaction and later turnover. And there are a number of factors that go into that. One of them is, again, being supportive and inclusive, and that there's been some really compelling studies coming out of Germany across hundreds of organizations showing that factor alone has a substantial effect on employees' performance and also on their turnover later from the organization. Did I answer your question?
Yeah.
Okay.
I'll ask you more.
Okay, great, okay. All right.
That's great. I always suggest to candidates to not think about whether they're going to get the job, but whether they're going to be successful in 6 to 8 months in the job. And if they focus on that and work their way backwards, most likely, as well as an interview team, we focus on that and work our way backwards. We can assess the right factors in regards to someone being successful and happy in their role. Lindsay, I'd love to hear your opinion within an organization. Who is or should be responsible for educating the hiring team on the organization's culture, or how do we assess culture fit during an interview? And then I'd love for other people's opinions as well.
I knew that this question was coming, and it makes me smile. And to Bruce's point earlier, I think fundamentally, if you feel like you have to educate your hiring team on what the culture is, it's a bit of an issue. Part of it is because culture is, as we've established. Everyone at your company should be able to, either to your face or beers on Friday nights with none of the coworkers around, be able to articulate what it's like to work at the company. So part of the interview process, to what we were saying before, is that the candidate needs to be able to get an authentic understanding of what the company culture is actually like. So if you have to educate your interview team, the chances that their answer is authentic are pretty low. I think you may want to educate, for example, introverts about how to articulate the thoughts that are in their head about company culture to the candidates. Those are more just sort of tactical interview tips. The 80-20 rule is a good example of that. Don't talk more than 20% of the time if you're interviewing someone, because you want to hear what they have to say. But really, as much as someone on the interview team is there to assess a culture fit, they're also there to represent the culture, and they should be authentic in that. So it typically does fall to either hiring managers or human resources on those sort of tactical tricks of the trade, like the 80-20 rule. But I would hesitate to say that you should have some sort of cultural education piece for your interview team.
Or any particular assessment, cues, values, thinking like an email that's sent out to the interview panel, how would culture fit? What would you be looking for them to respond? Yes, no, maybe, or additional color?
I think it would be fair for a team, particularly if there's a strong team culture, to come together and say, in a typical answer to a question like, what would be your ideal culture? What would we want to hear to be a marker for what might make someone successful for this team? It's also equally important to say what don't we want to hear, like what would be a red flag. But I would want more of a group consensus on that.
Talk about an organizational psychology. And the idea is that you want to let people know the good stuff. You're really trying to sell them on coming there, but you also want to tell them about some of the negative stuff they'll have to deal with. And not being, people get in and find out it's not the way you told them, they're going to feel like they were misled, and that's a really bad feeling. And they might start looking almost immediately to try to find a way to get out. What they find is that this really is important for setting people's expectations. If you give a realistic job preview towards the beginning, very often people will self-select and decide they don't want to join the organization. But at the same time, doing it at any time during the process, it's simply setting people's expectations. They know what they're getting into. They don't feel like that they were tricked. And I think that the more that you can let people know, the better they'll be able to deal with the good and the bad stuff at work.
I think that's an incredible point. I mean, in the tech industry, the chances that you're hiring this person to do something critical are pretty high, and yet the fact that so many companies don't trust interviewees to self-select out is astounding. This person can push code that can literally bring down your entire app, and yet you don't know if they're going to be able to tell whether or not this culture is going to be right for them or not. It's the wrong mentality to take into the interview process. I am honestly a fan of what Zappos does, which is they literally incentivize people to walk themselves through that self-selection process. We will pay you if you decide that you don't want to be here. We will give you $2,000 to literally put your mind to the problem of whether or not this culture is the right place for you. I think that's very smart.
And it's a small price, the $2,000.
Krista? I was going to say, it is, right? For most employees, you're looking at a 1.55, right? Half their salary again to onboard that employee. So you bring someone on who's not a good fit, that's pretty costly because that scales. You assume that the more senior the employee is, the more training they take, the more sort of creativity you have to bring them into the culture. So I think that's really interesting. And then to Lindsay's point, dating. I think everything's like dating. You don't go on a second date with a company that's an asshole, right? So you think about interviews, generally there's an interview structure, right? You work your way up. I know when I came to Simple, there was like a panel, and I showed up, and all of a sudden there were 6 dudes and me in a room with a couch, and I had no idea what I was getting into, but everybody was really warm and open. And so even though the panel was a bit daunting, it was very different than other panels I've been on. You go on a bad first date, you don't really want a second date. And maybe you do go on a second date, but the chances of having a happy marriage with that person are pretty slim to none. So you look at an interview process, I think it does say a lot about a company. Did they keep in touch? Would you go on a second date with someone where you went on a first date, you thought it was good, and then they didn't call for 2 weeks? We'd be like, no, fuck off. So I think those considerations,
And then do you really want the employee who says yes to you after you've treated them that way? You hope that people have enough self-respect to select out. To Lindsay's point, like, don't do it. So there's a lot of factors there.
Well, I think what would be great is to maybe talk more tactically about how, you know, 'cause a couple of you did respond with questions that you asked during an interview that do create an ability to maybe assess whether somebody would be successful in the role and fit the culture. You know, any tips and tricks? Bruce, you had a couple.
I'll totally riff into that direction, but I also want to add to what's been going on here that if you're doing your job as a hiring manager, the person sitting across from you is smarter than you are. And if you lie to somebody who's smarter than you are, they know when you're lying. So just tell them what's up, tell them what the job is, tell them the challenges, tell them the reality of where you work and what it's like to work there. You know, I'm lucky because I work at eBay in Portland where, you know, when it comes to showing something negative, like, there aren't a lot of Fortune 50 companies in Portland. So most people coming to interview here from the Portland market have no idea what it's like to be part of a giant company that has a significant amount of process that you can work with. It's not horrible, but there are problems. And so let's just put those right on the table during the interview and make sure they understand that the job isn't, you know, all around that person writing code the way they want to. So that was a bit of a riff, but I guess I look at the interview process not so much as dating, but as playing. You know, you got somebody there in the room with you. You wanna play. Let's find out what you can do with your mind and your head and where you can go. And as far as testing if somebody can fit in your culture, you need to find somewhere in their past where they experience culture somewhere else, and how do they respond to that? So a common question is just sort of talk your way around somewhere they worked in the past, find a problem, find somewhere where a project just went off the rails or something was misdefined or it all went wrong and everybody was working 7/12s. Stop them right there and then start to find out how it happened. Do they know where the problem came in? Do they know the other people that were working on this project? Do they understand why it takes 2 days to get something from engineering into production and that they couldn't just be pushed out magically? Do they understand why a marketing date was a hard date? They don't have to know everything, but do they have an awareness that there are systems that move through that cause that problem? Another thing I like to do at that point, once you're playing, is empower that person and say, cool, all right, so tell you what, I'm your boss at that point. I realize things are going wrong. I was able to pull in 3 engineers, and I'm gonna give them to you. What are you gonna do with those engineers? And see how they solve the problem with new bodies, and do they put those bodies into oversight roles? Do they put those bodies into churning out code? Can they see the impact of what those bodies would do? Now, I know this sounds like I'm trying to interview for a manager or somebody high level, but more I'm trying to find where that person can speak to the greater org they were working in and who was contributing and what would the influence be if they were to make decisions. That's always a very strong one for me. Let's see. I wrote a couple of these down because I can riff sideways pretty fast. Another thing I guess I look for is emotion. I need that person across from me to answer a question about emotion. What was the product you were the most proud of? Or what was the absolute worst day of your professional career? And then when you're talking to them, look them in the eyes. And if they're talking about the worst day in their life, is that the worst day in their life in their eyes? Or are they just telling you something, you know, and they're just riffing to give you a story because they want the job? And when you're looking for that proud moment or the elation moment, or why do you do engineering? Like, what's your passion? Why are you here? You got to see that. And again, this is all about play. And the hard part is making the interview into a place where the person's comfortable enough to play. But if you can't do that, you're not going to find out what they've got for you, for your team, and what they're going to bring. And I guess the one that I know everybody knows this one, but if somebody can't say I don't know, they're gonna have a hard time with change. And in the tech industry, what you're doing right now is not what you are going to be doing in 6 months, no matter how good you are. So you've got to be able to deal with change.
So I think you must be a really good interviewer. Because basically what you're talking about is really good structured interview approaches. I mean, you're trying to get people, ask people about situations they dealt with in the past, and how did they deal with it? Did they blame other people? Do they take ownership for any things they could have done differently? Do they know at this point what they should have done differently? And I think I like your spin on saying that it's a type of play, because I mean this in a good way. You're trying to get their guard down a little bit. You're trying to understand who they are, not just who they're trying to project. And I think that that's a really important part of understanding what their personality is like, is getting them to think about those past experiences and really getting to seeing how they dealt with them, and if they have any insight as a result of what they went through in the past. I have to say this, as a hiring manager, you're going to make mistakes sometimes. All you do with these processes, you have to remind yourself, you're not going to have any perfect selection. All you're doing is improving your odds. But if you can improve your odds, that's better than most other places might be able to do. So that's what you're really trying to do.
Great. Lindsay, you had a couple of great ones as well in some of the pre-questions we asked you.
Sure, and I really love, I think my questions riff very well off of your questions, because they do have to do with just trying to suss out an individual's personality. How competent are they going to be to self-assess whether or not your culture is going to be the right place for them? And so one of the ways I do that is to dive into motivation. So I'm going to get, if you have your pens ready, I'm going to give you all my super secret HR questions that I've asked everyone that I've interviewed, I think, for the last 6 years. And usually wait till the end of the formal interview, kind of like, oh yeah, wait, I just have a couple more questions. The first question I always ask them is, let's say it's the end of the day, you're headed home, your head is in your hands, you just want to get home to it's just been such an awful day, you just want to watch 5 episodes of Walking Dead back to back and down a bottle of wine. It was that bad of a day. What would have happened that day to send you home that way? Most people are not prepared to answer this question. Most people don't want you to know that they binge watch any television show or drink wine in the interview. But what I find is that you number one, a person's response does help you understand their level of authenticity they're bringing to the interview. If somebody's like, I have literally gotten responses like, oh, well, there just wouldn't have been enough hours in the day.
Or, too much done.
Yeah. Or, I just never really have bad days. We all have shitty days at work. It's a reality. This happens to everyone. Share your story with me. I want to hear it. What that question gets at is somebody's demotivators. What does bring this person down? When do they feel like they're not doing a good job? Because you want them to own being successful in this role, being a part of the culture, feeling great at work. And in order to do that, in order to own that, you have to know what's going to bring you down and how to get around it. And then I like to end on a high note, so then I ask them, okay, well, we're going to switch it around. Let's say you're headed home, you're skipping, high-fiving strangers in the street. It was such an awesome day at work. Woo! You're going to celebrate, it's going to be awesome. What would have sent you home that way? And see, conversely, what is it that really motivates this person? What helps them self-soothe? Your recognition program isn't ever going to be able to be all things to every person. So what can this person do in their day-to-day to build themselves up, to make them feel like they're doing a good job, to make them feel like they've accomplished something, that they're living out the purpose that they intended for their life, work, career, the whole thing. And again, people are really not expecting that question either. And so their answers are usually so telling, and it's really easy to say if somebody, if somebody says, well, I'm a perfectionist, so it would get me down if things didn't go directly as I had planned, but it makes me feel great when every detail that I planned out was executed to the nth degree. You're like, that's awesome. We are a crazy startup where you will never ever achieve perfection. You instantly know that they're not going to be the right fit for your culture. I just find that getting somebody to really tell you their deepest stories about what gets them excited, what would send them off in a great mood, or what would just completely crush them, is a great way of understanding what really makes them tick.
Great. I'm going to switch subjects. So certainly, does anybody have any follow-up for that?
So I was just going to say I have a colleague in Germany who's a leader in studying interview cues from the part of the interviewee, but he's really switching out and going the whole typology for interviewer cues, and it's interesting so far. I mean, he's just started to undo it through a series of really intensive studies, and asked me in 5 years. But I think that some of these things that you can communicate in the interview are really important, and it's neat. It's a lot of interesting stuff. That's all.
Not that I think anybody on this panel or in the room would use culture fit as maybe a bias or a discrimination, but as a recruiter, I have over and over heard not a culture fit, and I said, well, what does that mean? And they're like, not a fit, okay? Don't ask me to tell you why. So, can we, I don't know, Krista, have you or, somebody, have dealt with, maybe these biases or discriminations that are hidden under not a culture match, and, how do you deal with that?
Yeah, so, for the last 2 months, I've been trying to hire my boss. So that's like a cool, weird position to be in, right? You're like picking your future. And I think one of the things that I look at is you can ask someone a question and you can say, would we ever do that? Or before this person came in, would that have been something that even would have been within the realm of consideration? So throwing out a hypothetical. There are some things that have been presented where it's sort of the antithesis of what the company would have come to on its own. And not from a creative perspective, but that perhaps it goes against our values or our norms or our beliefs. It's actually at odds with those. So I would say that would be not a culture fit. In terms of selecting culture fit, one of the things we do at Simple is you throw someone in the interview loop that has nothing to do with that person's role. Because they really don't care how good they are at marketing or development. When I interview a front-end developer, I am not capable of asking technical questions. But I can figure out, would I want to hang out with you? And there's that really shitty question of, could you be stuck in an airport for 7 hours or whatever it is? I don't know what the number test is. But that's not really the question. It's like, do I respect you? Do I like you? Do I feel like you like me? Did you feel comfortable in the room when you were talking with each other? Did they have things that felt like they would contribute something to the organization that isn't already present? But I think, again, the biggest question is, would it actually make your job worse? A lot of people, you look at startups particularly, and you get sort of, there's a homogenous culture that's not necessarily constructive. When I came into Simple again, I was like this chick who didn't exist. There were no women there, and it was a bunch of bros who at the time all had launch beards. So it was what I called the WBM, the white bearded male. It was just like a sea of white bearded dudes, and then me. And I'm sure it was like, oh God, we're hiring a woman who might actually be feminine too. This is going to get super weird. But does it actually make it worse? You don't necessarily need to fit. You just need to be similar enough or share enough commonality that you're not making everyone else's job worse. Which sounds kind of backwards. But if you keep looking for fit, you just get the same. And you have a sea of clones, and you'll never really project your business into the future. You stunt yourself.
That was actually one of the answers that I gave you. I said the same thing but in a different way, which is, you don't want to, if you're just simply saying I'm comfortable with this person, you're going to end up with homogeneity. And you have to be really careful that that's not what you're doing. And I think the question is, do I feel comfortable with this? Do I feel comfortable with this person? Yeah, I just don't think they're a good fit. End of story. Or you try to really break it down the way that you did. Think about these, so you don't keep it as a series of questions. Make yourself answer these questions. Will this person really add something? Will they bring something? maybe they're not the same as everybody else, but will that be a great contribution? But don't just let it slide off in terms of just your general impression without thinking about it too deeply, because that's how you get yourself into trouble of just sort of replicating who you already are and keeping and not bringing any diversity into the organization.
And I think it's important too to understand that culture isn't a shield to keep, people that are unlike out. That really, if you're using culture fit as a way to prevent your culture from evolving or changing, you're in the danger zone. I don't know what else to say. Cultures have to naturally evolve. In Silicon Valley, you see it happen where a company gets 6 years old and was founded by, a bunch of white bearded males who eat pizza all the time and are, actually live out of the office and never leave and rarely shower. And 6 years later, they're all, maybe they've IPO'd, they all have huge houses in San Francisco and 3.5 kids, and the culture's going to be different. Cultures evolve because we grow older and we want different things. I think that's why millennials will probably have 30 different jobs in the course of their careers, because we realize that our tastes change. We like different things. We decide to shift the course of our life. That's exciting. It's actually awesome that we live in an age where we can have 30 unique job experiences. That's pretty amazing. But if you're using your culture fit as a shield to keep your culture from evolving, it's going to grow stale. It's not going to get injected with new blood and new thought and new energy and new ideas. And is that really the kind of culture that you want to be a part of? It's the same old every day.
I'll take my turn. I said earlier that the people across the table from you are smarter than you. They're also better at doing what they do than you are. And so when you're interviewing that person, if you get a perfect culture fit feeling, you're probably interviewing yourself. And I know we're sort of all echoing this homogeneity concept that culture is actually a bad thing. In that sense, that you self-attract toward yourself. You got to throw the ego away, and also the other person's got an ego that's going to conflict with you as well. So you got to look at what they can actually do and what their talents are. And this is where your interview panel, or at least here we use interview panels. I deploy my interviewers like sensors. I need to find out if this person's good at doing what they do. And what they do, I have no idea if they're any good at it, because I don't know what they do. They have a skill I don't have. So I need to surround them with other people that I trust. I need somebody with a brain that's really good at judging their ability to use logic. And I need to take another employee who's really good at determining, does this person have an emotional quotient. Deploy your interview panel. And then as far as the question of, does a negative culture fit call mask bias? If your interview panel comes back and anyone on that panel says no, don't hire that person. But you don't just be like, okay, we're done, let's bring in 5 more people. You got to sit down with that person and find out why, because they're exposing a weakness in your own perception of the person you're hiring, and you got to find out why that person said no. And quite often you'll actually convince the person to go the other way, and then you'll hire that person. This is the process, but if you don't use your panel to strengthen you, you're going to screw up.
I guess the only thing I'd add is that there's been research that shows that decisions about hiring are better made when it's very structured. You don't just go and gut, and that you actually try to set up some questions, use as much information as you can, as many sources as you can, multiple interviewers seems to increase decision quality, multiple questions, multiple criteria that you've set up in advance and that you're thinking about. The more you can structure the hiring process, the better decision you're going to make than if you're simply saying, yeah, I like this person, I think they know what they're talking about. You need to be able to articulate why it is you like that person and what it is that they've got going for them. If you can't, then you need to start to question your own judgment about
Great, and we're just about, we got 15 more minutes, but I did have one last question. And this is for anybody who'd like to answer. A couple opted out in the pre-questions, but what are thoughts, definition, or on the overall Portland tech community culture?
So this is something I thought a lot about last week. There was it's called Tech Town Portland. So it was an initiative that was sort of, that was set out there. I think it's really about inclusivity. So if you can get 13 tech companies to contribute money to one project and then work together to drive publicity or marketing value for each other, and for this specific video, there were 3 companies chosen out of 12, and everybody was cool with that. That says so much about Portland. It's an inclusive culture. It's one that's supportive. There's an open door policy, not at a company, but across companies. I don't know how often I have people email me who have similar jobs at other companies here in Portland saying, hey, can I just get some free advice? My answer is always yes, but it's more shocking when I do it and that's what I receive in return. There's collaboration. There's a lot of conversation. It's just for the sake of information sharing. I think that's really unique, and then when I speak to friends and colleagues of mine who are in other markets who have similar jobs or very different jobs, that doesn't exist. You go to San Francisco, you're not going to get 2-hour dinner, which is free consulting with someone. You're paying for that time. So I think that's really interesting. And then, that there's an education across companies, right? So maybe you work within one role, but most of the folks I talk to say, okay, I might work within design, but I'm really interested in marketing. And a lot of companies in Portland, there's this desire to educate your employees beyond their specific skill set. I think that's very unique, or so I've seen so far.
Having moved up here from the Bay Area just over about a year and a half ago, the word that always came to my mind when folks down there would ask me, like, oh, what's the Portland tech scene like? It's earnest. People up here actually do believe that the technology that they're working on will change the world. They're not in it to have a huge splashy IPO. They're not in it to, because it's the rat race that you're supposed to do if you get an MBA from Stanford. It's like people are actually here because they believe in what they're doing. I think that they're because they have so much belief in what they're doing, they're willing to be open and collaborate about it. The city and its tech scene are fantastic. People here, last week as well, Technology Association of Oregon launched its Innovate Oregon initiative, where people in Portland actually do care about giving back. People in the Portland tech scene care about giving back to civic enterprises, to educational programs. They're already, as small as we are, we're already thinking about those things so far ahead of the game to ward off essentially what happened in the Bay Area, where there was this isolated tech bubble that never thought about giving back. And I think that that earnestness is just so invigorating. It gives so much energy to what we're all doing. The fact that all of you guys are here on a random Tuesday night because you actually care about company culture and building healthy company cultures, it's amazing. Not to get all sappy, you guys, but it totally warms my heart. It's awesome. It makes it feel like the way that Portland is building up our tech scene is so authentic, and it really gives us a chance to use what we're doing to make the world a better place. I've totally bought in, guys. I've jumped in. One thing I will say, though, and I think it's fair, is that earnestness often belies a bit of being naive. I think we still have a lot to learn. We do need to get a bit more organized. The incubators that we have here in town are awesome, but they need even more support. I love that we have the community funding programs now, where we can actually, as a community, start funding some of these companies that we believe in. There's still a long way to go, but our hearts are in the right place, and I find that really solidified my decision to move back here from the Bay Area.
I'll just do the Portland shout out again that, if you want Silicon Valley, you can go south. And if you want Seattle, you can go north. And we're protected by the fact that those places exist to self-select that sort of madness out of our town. And I've been doing this for 20 years. I thought at some point, somewhere along the way, somebody would figure out that I was a sham, or they would figure out that they could hire somebody better and move them to Portland and they could do my job. But it didn't happen. And now I'm a graybeard, and now I got kids, and now I got a house. There's a mountain over there, there's an ocean over there. There's a river right through the middle of this town, and this is Portland, you guys. And we gotta hold on to our community and make sure that everybody, when they go to work, we know they go home. So, I mean, we said early on that culture it's your people, but your people have lives and families outside of the building. And so if you make decisions based solely on the 8 to 14 hours a day of the employees in your building, that's the wrong decision. You need to make the decision based on the 24/7 that they live.
Great. Let's get some Q&A. Yes, great. Ariane, I see you in the back. We're going to give you a mic.
Yeah, so in order
We're going to get you a mic. It's
Okay.
coming. It's real quick.
Hi, my name is Ariane. I am interested in hearing from the panelists, especially the three that are with different companies, whether you've codified your corporate culture, even though it's constantly changing, if you have a document or something that you use to kind of capture what it is, to socialize what your values are and all that good stuff.
It's hard for me to answer your question because I can't point to a document or a wiki, but you know, we do see it in, you know, we have Metal Shirt Fridays, and there's the link that somebody always sends around, you know, and there's the chat conversations that always keep it human and always kind of, as soon as things get all corporate-y, or as soon as somebody sends out a link about Carl Icahn and a whole bunch of silliness in the stock market, somebody immediately responds with the human element, and that's our culture. So I guess my answer from my perspective is no, but I don't mean to discount anybody who has written that document.
Before I was in the world of tech, I was in the world of design, and actually worked with a couple design firms in town here. And my advice would be, if you are growing so fast, or you just feel like you need sort of a physical element to capture what your culture is, make sure it's authentic to your brand, to your values, to your purpose. Make sure it feels authentic. Don't do the, like, I just painted up our, 5 values up on the lunchroom wall, because that's no, it doesn't inspire anybody to actually follow the values. I'll cite a reference. There's a company in town here called Nemo Design. A bunch of really crazy designers. It doesn't feel like somebody's telling the employees what to do, which wouldn't fit the culture. It actually is something that they can celebrate and is very on brand for that company. I've seen incredibly well-designed brand books, internal brand books, where a company uses images and materials to help Nike, of course, it's like the gold standard in how to communicate a culture and a brand in the country. Those two things cannot exist side by side. So we have to give back. We have to care. Again, Portland is a caring town, so hopefully that will come naturally to us. But we need to lead the charge in getting involved in civic and educational initiatives here in town. We need to demand more from our state representatives. We need to be active in our children's schools. I see all those things as very natural evolutions for this tech culture.
So I don't know, I guess this is an opportunity, but I suppose it's sort of a downfall that I've been thinking a lot about recently, is that it is difficult actually in many cases to attract people to Portland. And people are gonna be like, no, there's mountains and people are nice, and that's true. But in a lot of cases, the people you wanna hire are already gainfully employed. That's why they're hired. So you're going after them and they're saying, but when I come to Portland, what if it doesn't work out? Like, what if I try this thing with you? I uproot my family. for those most senior employees, and they come here and they settle down, and then it doesn't work out with your company. What else is there? And so I think, again, an opportunity is for us to all work together to build a culture whereby if it doesn't work out for that employee, they are gracefully exited, as Lindsay so aptly said, and they have somewhere else to go, that there is a culture, that they understand that there's something beyond your company's walls. Otherwise, it is very difficult to recruit employees because they see it as a one and done, and then they're back to wherever they started. In Airbnb, you guys are rad. I remember when you guys came in, we went and did like a cove river float together with Simple, full of love and joy, so awesome.
I wondered if you could share questions that you may have gotten from applicants that have made you think most deeply about your company culture or about company culture in general, or even Portland tech culture.
I get asked often on an initial phone screen, like, can you describe the culture at X? And I like to say, I'd rather talk about our values and how those actually show up on a day-to-day basis. But that it's interesting because I always get, describe your company culture. And it's like, we have a robot of Bruce here. Is that a Muppet robot that rides a scooter? It's pretty awesome. But so that's one way that that it is. It's asked every time I have to pause and almost like literally think of what I'm gonna say because I don't have a prescribed answer for it. And every day I don't have every phone call. But
the toughest questions actually have come from individuals that would add such a huge element of diversity to the company, but they don't necessarily want to be the pioneer. I'm the first trans person that may be at your company. I'm the first African American person that may be at your company. What's that going to be like for me? And the truth is, I don't know that you can answer that question. You can talk about being inclusive, you can talk about the values of your company, but if they're the pioneer, it's going to be hard to tell them exactly what their day-to-day is going to be like, and you sure as hell don't want to tell them that they aren't going to encounter some weirdness. Describing the support structures, describing commitments to inclusiveness and diversity can go some level, but really those are really tough questions to answer. One thing that I've done in the past is when those pioneers do come on board, to make sure that you're checking in often and asking them about how their experience is and asking them, how should I answer that question that you had for me? What is your experience like? To be honestly invested in what that onboarding and day-to-day experience is so you can share that with others.
One question is like, what sucks? If you looked at yourself and someone's like, what sucks about you? Tell me all the things that are terrible. It's a really hard question to answer, honestly, especially if you want that person to then join your company. I had someone ask me that recently, and I was like, oh man, okay. And he was like, no, but for reals, tell me 2 things that really suck about this company. And I had to be kind of honest. I was like, okay, these are 2 things that suck for me. But asking someone to share their ugly, I think, is actually kind of a good question, because in turn, how authentic is the person that is interviewing you able to be? Are they authentic? Or they're like, it sucks how nice everyone is here. I feel so mean because everybody's so nice, and it sucks that no one works at all. So when I work 5 hours, that's more than everyone else. I think that's a really telling question.
great. Had some more questions here in the front. Tammy, do you have one here? Becca? She's in the purple sweater yeah, she's
purple sweater first. Sorry,
yep.
Jennifer.
So my name's Becca. So I have a question. You all mentioned asking people about their worst day at work or stuff like that. And I've also read a lot of interview advice that you really don't want to be talking negative about your past job experiences, but then some people have had really, truly abusive work situations and bosses and cultures. So I'm kind of curious how you create enough safety for people to answer that question honestly. Like I've been asked that question, and I have been in situations that have been truly abusive and horrible, and I don't know how to answer that honestly.
Actually, I think that's a really good question, because right, if a person seems to always blame other people, I've always been mistreated where I worked in the past, and they talk badly about where they worked in the past, that could be a red flag. It's a delicate balance. I think it's one thing to say a person had a particular negative experience. It's one thing if they've had talking about their last 5 jobs, that every single one of them they blame the people that they worked with. I think it's trying to tease that apart, but you're raising a really good question, because if people work long enough, at some point they're going to face a negative situation of some sort. Okay.
Well, why don't we let him finish, and and we can.
And so I think that you have to allow them to be able to answer that question and to see, if it's something that is it's not an easy solution, but it's looking at a pattern versus, again, if a person works long enough, they will have some negative experiences.
But how do they feel safe talking about it even to begin with? Because we've all been told not to say anything.
Right. I don't have an answer for that. I honestly don't, because that's something that interviewees are told to do all the time, is stay away from the negative past experiences.
I guess this is exactly where you have to make the human connection, and I have to tell you something about my life. I have to tell you something that's wrong, and you ask, tell me you're ugly. I have very good bosses here, because they allow me to speak pretty freely in this building about the things that are wrong. And so if I'm in an interview with somebody and I'm asking them to tell me their worst situations, if this is the part about the play, and this is the part about making it work, is you have to get to the point where you've hit a harmony. So I would have to tell you what's crappy about this job. I would have to tell you how, I've worked with these people for 20 years and they're my family, and how it hurts really bad when things go wrong. So,
and when I ask questions, I ask them in just the order that I described. So I first ask a hypothetical. If you were to have a bad day, what might have sent you home that way? So it's not specific to your previous experiences, but you can talk in general about the things that get you down, and you can share that openly. But I always make sure that I end on what makes you excited at work, what makes you happy, and that's on purpose. I want to make sure that somebody feels like the last thing they get to say as they're leaving an interview is a really clear description about what makes them really excited when they're at work, what brings them joy when they're at work, and to feel like they were heard.
I think that this is sort of to riff off that, but how do you want to be judged as an applicant? What is the thing that you want to dwell on? If you have 30 minutes within an interview, do you want to talk about something negative in the past? Or do you want to talk about emotion, or do you want to talk about fact? Because how much can you bring into this new role, and what can you pull out of your potential employer to talk about? These are skills, or these are things that I really enjoyed. When we've all had a bad boss, or most of us. Talking about that person isn't going to help bring clarity to the future, because you're certainly, if the hiring manager is an asshole, you've probably already deduced that by the time you got into the interview. But if there are specific things, so I certainly would want someone to feel comfortable, but I would also encourage those who are interviewing and being interviewed to think about, what can we focus on in our 30 minutes together that's going to help us figure out if we're a good fit. Talking about someone in the past, or a thing in the past that was isolated to that experience, may not be a productive conversation.
Do you have, just right in front of you in the blue, Jennifer had a question.
Yeah, I'm Jennifer. I work at a company that does a really good job of encouraging innovation with the product development people. In fact, product development people are always adding more features and changing the specifications as they go along. And then they also do a really good job of encouraging the marketing communications people to aggressively get that information out there. So this is not a dating question, this is a marriage question. We got a problem when we're always printing brochures that aren't right anymore, and the two groups are really trying to support each other, but there's all this sibling rivalry. So this is a evolving culture thing that we really struggle with, and I'd like to know what you think are some of the best practices.
One thing I would say is, are you all benchmarked on the same thing? So I lead communications and for now brand at Simple. We actually all have the same, I don't know if this is really sharing too much, same bonus structure. So we're all benchmarked the same. So if product isn't giving me the right information, then I'm not marketing the right information. If I'm not marketing the right information, there are users coming on board who have a misrepresentation of product, right? You get this feedback loop. I think that is a best practice. Are you all being measured the same way? And if not, then ask leadership why. Because you're not setting up the organization for success. There's infighting. As you said, there's sibling rivalry. There's no good marriage where you look at someone else and say, like, I need this from you. It's about what can I give you, right? Those are the best partnerships, where you feel satisfaction from making the other person happy. It's a symbiotic relationship.
Great. I know we're about 10 minutes over 8, so some people are getting up, but probably wrap it up then with this question. But certainly, yeah, feel free to respond, but feel free as well if you need to, leave to do so.
I guess I want to throw in, to extend the metaphor, sure, it's a marriage, but a marriage isn't just two people, it's two people and the story around it. You've got the house, you've got the kids, you've got the dream, and these are the things that tie the marriage together. So if you have a company where two different groups aren't working well, are infighting, and they don't see the context that the other group is working in, I'll challenge that leadership needs to be telling that story in every meeting and saying, look, we're going to have to change this because of this. And if that's a stupid reason, then leadership needs to say, no, we're not going to change it. We're going to take a hit. Or maybe you're trying to go too fast. And so I can get away with saying things like, perhaps it's leadership's problem. But I mean, if somebody can't explain why things are going wrong, and it just seems like somebody's doing something